Hello. So this is a slightly different intro. I don't even have my YouTube page up yet. Um, so I've been having a bad few days. As you know, well, let's start off with what's going on today. At 9 a.m., my beautiful cat that likes to, this one who's about to come up here, who likes to be on camera and meow and purr and do all the cute stuff and kiss me and rub her whiskers on my face, decided to jump down from my window ledge onto my sleeping face. She got up here, which is fine. She got my nose, which is fine. And she got my eye, which is not fine. Come on, come up. I know. I spent almost all day today at the doctor. The insurance will not cover the second part until 24 hours later. So I need minor plastic surgery on this eye. This eye. Sorry. Is it this eye or that eye? This eye. I need minor plastic surgery, if you can see right there. So we will see what happens. They had everything set up. They were ready to go. And, well, the insurance denied them the permission to fix my eye until 24 hours after my initial visit. You heard me correct. I was in the doctor's office. I'd been there since 9 a.m. It was now 3 o'clock. And because we had to switch facilities for them to do what they need to do to this eye, the insurance denied them. So I have to wait 24 hours from my initial visit, from my release of my initial visit, which was 10 something, to get this eye fixed. So, yay. But we are doing Wes Huff today. We're doing a Wes Huff interview where I am going to be correcting him from a Catholic perspective. Don't get excited, you atheists out there who think I'm going to correct him on all his apologetics. Kip, I'm looking at you through my one good eye. But yeah, I've had a really shitty, I've had a really shitty few days. Oh my gosh. How's it going, BS? How did your show go? Did you get it going? So this is going to probably be our video for the next 2 or 3 days. Look at this is the monster. Look what she did to me. So this is going to be our stuff for the next few days. Here we go. Hopefully the sound is good. All right. I have been having just a little bit of issue with my...
Council of Nicaea doesn't even talk about the books. Council of Nicaea doesn't even talk about the books of Scripture. So nothing at the Council of Nicaea has anything to do with the canon of Scripture. That's already...
Fair enough.
An established fact. And they, within the 2nd century. Within the 2nd century,
But for the Roman Empire, though, because they were still torturing Christians at that time.
But the Roman Empire is still pagan by the time you get the Edict of Milan and the decriminalization of Christianity.
I know. That's what I'm saying.
So the way that they set this up is actually a real false... For those that don't know, B.S. Lewis is trying to get into my racket of live streaming, which is okay because I stole this from Garmania. So that's all right. It's all right.
So how would the Roman Empire have gotten along with the acceptance of what the Gospels are?
Oh, they don't. No, this is established by...
So this opening is all false premising. This is all false premising. This is not actually how the framing actually goes in the in actual history, but that's okay.
Christianity.
Yes.
So Christians,
I know that.
So Christians already have the 27 books that we call the New Testament.
And who would you say established that? Like,
would
it may
be
not
the
be one
church
person, but like, what
fathers.
people said, yo, this is what we're going with.
So there are lots of canon lists within the early church. So
What's up, guys? If you haven't already, please smash that subscribe button and hit that
I
like button
will
on the
not.
video. And if you don't have time,
transverse myelitis is a condition that's related to MS in the sense of
I don't care about
it's
that.
the Book of Mormon's there. Give it a read if you want. And so when I was in high school, I wouldn't call it a crisis of faith. I think that's way too over-exaggerated for
You're
what
thinking.
took place. Yeah, I'm just wrestling through some of these questions. And part of that entailed, I did read the Quran cover to cover for the first time.
How was that?
Confusing. I mean, I would go on later in life to really study the
So I read through the Quran twice. I read it for the first time when I was in college. I didn't finish it. And then I read it for the second time here on my channel, which I did finish, but the last 100 episodes or so were lost due to the hard drive that I had it on, the little flash drive going bad. But yeah, the second time I read the Quran, when I finally finished it, I was doing it on audiobook because I had gotten tired of reading it. But yeah.
the Quran a little bit more in like my formal education in university and studying world religions and stuff. I didn't realize at the time that the Quran was very different than the Bible, even though there's some crossover. In that the Bible is a little bit more chronological, where the first book is in the beginning and the last book is at the end.
Yes.
The Quran is situated with the longest chapters at the front and the shortest chapters at the back.
If you read the Hadith, you will see that it actually has more of a structure toward poetry. There's a type of poetry in Arabia, the Arabic poetry, that it matches up with almost perfectly. Although they deny that it's that kind of poetry, although it clearly is. Give me 1 second. The ointment is starting to get into my eye. I need to go wipe it down. I'll be right back. I'm going to come back with some tissues. Come on, get up, honey. Sorry, from time to time you're going to see me dabbing my eye. If that grosses you out, I am so sorry. Oh my gosh. This is going to be a hell of a night. So let's see. A few days ago, when I tried to buy my plane tickets, I didn't have access to my money for a variety of reasons. Then after the delay, my wife had a nightmare and decided that it made her remember trying to take care of my dad. And basically, she knows that I have diabetes, and she's worried that one day she would have to take care of me, and she doesn't want to do that. More so because of the Alzheimer's and the diabetes. She doesn't want to be in that situation in the future. So she decided for a divorce. She's not the kind of person to care for someone, is what she said. Right? And then this morning, my little cat decides to jump from top of my bed, from a ledge on a window ledge, right onto my face. On the upside, I'm going to take the money that I had saved up for China, and I'm going to use that to go back to school. I'm going to do online education because I don't have time to go to school full time. And because I'm 44, I don't feel like being the oldest person at school. And I'm probably going to do it in either writing or in literature. And then once I have a solid degree, not just my humanity of arts, but once I have a more solid degree, even if it's an online degree, as long as it's accredited under my belt, I will then apply for either seminary or I will apply for some kind of biblical. Yeah, Thomas. That's why I'm not pissed. That's why I'm not pissed off. That's why I'm not sad. We've been married for 8 years. Oh, we've been married for 7 years and dating, and we dated for a year before then. We've been together for 8 years. And she left last year after taking care of my dad for one day, after I told her not to. I had to leave for work early one day for some reason, and she had a day off, and I said, don't mess with my dad. I'll be home, and I'm going to do it. I came home, and she was done. She was frazzled. She was ready to leave. And then she cut down one of my trees that I asked her not to cut down. We had an argument, and she was gone the next day. And then a few months later, she's like, that argument was staged. She, meaning I'm going to say I, but she had made it to where we'd have to have that argument, so she had an excuse to leave. And then she told me, like I said, 2 nights ago, and I didn't quite understand what she said until today when I was at the hospital, at the clinic, and I couldn't leave, and I could only think, and I was replaying what she said, and it finally clicked what she was saying. Basically, that between my diabetes and my dad's Alzheimer's, she's worried that at some point in the future she'd have to take care of me, and she doesn't think she can do it. So, I mean, I don't blame her. Me taking care of my dad is not a pleasant thing, so I get it. But it does mean I married the wrong person. So, yeah. We are not married in the church, in the Catholic Church. We've been fighting for that approval. We have never gotten it. It would be very ironic if we suddenly got it today. But at the end of the day, it looks like I'll be able to get married again should I meet someone. But this also means I have an opportunity to either go into the priesthood or to become a monk. I haven't discerned that at all. Everything's too fresh and too new. Let's get on with Wes, shall we?
So it reads a little bit more confusing. You don't necessarily start from the beginning and work through, because the way that it's organized is just not the same way that something like, and it's also one book more than, the Bible is 66 books. And it's 66 books. It's written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents by close to 40 different authors in 3 different languages. And so it's an anthology, right?
Let's be a little blunt here. Wes is wrong. So there's 88 books in the Coptic Bible. I think there's 77 in the Catholic. I'm not really sure about the Catholic right now. My brain's a little fuzzy. I've had a rough few days. There is, I don't know, 4 more books in the Orthodox. The Catholic Bible is open to a treasury canon, to a triary canon. So the primary canon is the 66 books that he's talking about, and that is divided into 2, the Old Testament and the New. Then there's a secondary canon called Deuterocanon. Protestants, insultingly, and I would say ironically, but let's just say incorrectly, label that the Apocrypha. That's not the Apocrypha. That's the Apocrypha. But they label it the Apocrypha, and so be it. Then what they don't understand is that Catholics are open to the extended canon. So there's one day a possibility that if the Eastern and Western churches re-merge into one single church, yet again, where only small pockets of standouts from the Latin and from the Greek don't merge back together, what you'll do is you'll have a larger canon. So you'll have Bibles with 3-fold canonicity, and the primary canon, the Deuterocanon canon, which is already in the Catholic Bible, and the Treasury canon. Now, here's the thing about that third canon: it will be in place, so it won't be in an appendix, it won't be in the back, it won't be in the middle, like how some older Protestant Bibles did with the quote-unquote Apocrypha. It will actually just be intermixed where it's supposed to be, according to tradition. And there is some disagreement between the East and the West on what order they go in, and just as there's some disagreement between Catholic and Jewish people into what order they go in. So ironically, don't take Wes's words here as gospel. It is not. He's giving a Protestant perspective. This drove Vishanti crazy in Kip Davis's stream earlier today, which I was listening while I was skateboarding because I have an eye injury. I don't have a leg injury, and I was bored. So I was skateboarding while listening to Kip Davis's. I started listening to Kip Davis's stream while at the doctor's office. Got out, did something with my dad. It was a 3-hour stream, so it was plenty. Ow. So there was plenty of time. Can't make facial expressions right now. There was plenty of time, so I went ahead and skateboarded while listening to his stream. I don't have great field of depth right now, so I only skateboarded on one side. I only used my dominant leg as the pushing leg. I usually like to do switch, but switch, I'm already have kind of bad balance, and I didn't feel like falling on top of everything else that's going on with me.
You're dealing with different cultures, different
Yes.
linguistic perspectives. Job is a very different book than the book of Acts, which is
Yeah, it's amazing the range.
yeah. Whereas the Quran is kind of situated in one particular vein of history. It's written.
No, the Quran is going to be influenced from Gnostic religions, from Gnostic Christianities, the heretics that come down and are exiled after the Great Diaspora. And when this happens, they will influence the native cultures there. If you read the Quran and if you read the Hadith, there seems to be an implication that it was Muhammad's father who was being influenced by these Gnostic beliefs. But according to the Quran and to the Hadith, it was the angel Gabriel who was telling Muhammad these truths. And at one point, this is called the Satanic Verses for those that don't know, a demon tried to influence him. Now, according to the official telling, the demon didn't succeed. According to the unofficial telling, there are several unofficial verses or unofficial surahs that have been stricken from the Quran. That bleeds into the history of the Quran, where there's actually 3 or 4, maybe even 5 major traditions. So it would be like as if all 12 disciples wrote their own accounting of Jesus' life, but just his life and nothing else. And from those eyewitness accounts, they then had arguments over which version, which recitation, because it was all oral, was the correct version. This would lead to wars in Islam and wars in Arabia from this. This is all important stuff and important history. Now, there are some that claim that everything that I just said to you is later history that is made up looking back at how the Quran came to be and how Islam came to be the dominant force in Arabia. I don't know enough about that to verify or deny, but if you read the Hadith and the Quran, you will get one specific flavor, one specific story, and different takes on it, depending on which version of Islam you are ascribed to.
In 7th century Arabia.
Yes.
It's written in a single language, Hijizi script Arabic. And so even though it's claiming to harken back to stories that predated and, reflect on some of the stories that you find in the Bible of the prophets of Abraham, of Moses, of Jonah, even Jesus, John the Baptist, Mary there and there, it's still very much one place at one time.
Yes.
In a different way that the Bible is.
Again, the Quran actually in the verses jumps verse to verse. So he's saying that it's unchronological, as in the largest is in the front and the shortest is in the end. It's not even like that. Every verse is out of order. So the verses don't tell a single story. It's poetry, it's recitation. So certain verses will actually be talking about different time periods. So you have to piece the verses together from different areas to understand the full story. So you'll be hearing a story about one thing, and then suddenly you hear about Joseph, or suddenly you hear about Mary, or suddenly you hear about Noah, and it just jumps around. The first few, I think the first 3 or the first 5 chapters of the let's call them surahs of the Quran are beautiful. But once you get into, because it's out of order and because the poetry is intermixed, once you start getting to the battles and the warfare and the betrayal of the Christians and the betrayal of the Jews, the story starts changing very rapidly, and the Quran becomes a very ugly book about war and betrayal and espionage. And I don't mean ugly as in the poetry is not beautiful. The poetry is still beautiful, but it's talking about the ugliness of humanity and the horrible, horrible results of warfare. So it is not the same as the Bible in any kind of way. It's written very differently, and it's written with a very different style of writing in mind.
Do you like, so you're studying this when you're a teenager. Obviously, you're older now. You've been studying it for years and years and years. We were talking off camera, having a great conversation about all the different languages you look at and stuff like that. We'll get to that today. But I always ask the question of my different guys I've had in here, like, say, on the ancient history side of stuff, who have some theories about things. I always ask them if their belief system, because that is a belief system too, ever they feel like it drives the results they end up getting, like a confirmation bias, if you will. Do you ever think about that with respect to your faith? Because that's obviously something very personal.
I think that is a good question. There are later questions in this interview, which is a 3-hour interview. We're not getting through all of it in one night. This is probably going to be today, tomorrow, the next day. There are later questions that seem really dumb on the level of Mark, the moderator from the non-debate. But he starts off with some really good, heavy-hitting questions. Obviously, he's got a more popular show than I do, and he might be playing dumb just for the sake of the audience, so an uninitiated audience can hop in. He also cusses a bit more than I would like for someone who's asking religious stuff, but this guy is not doing a religious show, so it's okay. And I cuss all the time too, so that's not even what I'm saying. I'm just saying for someone who's doing a specific religious thing, that's why you're watching this, because Wes Huff is on. This guy's going to cuss a lot more than you're comfortable with, the host.
To you as well?
Yeah, I mean, we all have biases.
Yes.
I mean, find me the person who's neutral, and you're not dealing with a real individual, right?
possible.
So I'm totally fine with the biases that I hold, and particularly in regards to the confessional biases that I
I'm
have.
totally fine with the biases that I hold.
Confessional?
Yeah, so confession of something saying like Jesus Christ is God. That's a confession.
So the confession that Catholics ascribe to are two, which is the Constantinople and the Apostles' Creed. I was going to say the Assassin's Creed. The Apostles' Creed.
Statement based on like, so in Christianity, you literally have
And the Constantinopolitan Creed.
historic confessions.
Is it Constantinople Nicene or Nicene Constant? I don't know. It's a long title when you read the whole thing out. And like I said, my brain's a little fried.
Like the Nicene Creed is a confessional statement. Or
Okay, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed is one that Catholics ascribe to, and the second is the Apostles' Creed. That's pretty much it.
the Apostles' Creed, or there are some catechisms. There's the Westminster Catechism, the London Baptist 1689 Catechism. Like, these are different parts within
He's saying
the
catechisms, but they're also confessions. So the Westminster Catechism or the Westminster Confession, you have these confessions of faith, which are function as these longer creeds. And you can look at the Creeds and Confessions Bible from Crossway, and it contains all of them. It's really useful to understand how different denominations frame the faith and what dogmas they ascribe to and which dogmas they deny. It's very useful.
history of Christianity that state the belief systems. And so the idea is that those confessions and the idea of where they come from in church history, that has a vote and a voice, but ultimately Scripture has the veto.
The veto.
The veto. So as a Protestant, as a historical Protestant, which is a
So in Catholicism, we hold to a slightly different ideal, and I'm going to go ahead and share that with you right now. Give me 1 second to grab 2 items. I will be right back. I am not prepared for this at all, by the way, just FYI for anyone watching at home. So for Catholics and Christians of all stripes, the liturgy is actually older than the Bible, much older. And prayer is even older than that. So when Christians especially Catholics and Orthodox, are looking to understand the faith, they're not looking at the Gospels first. They're looking at practice. Most Christians and Catholics and most Christians, Catholics, and Orthodox will define faith as practice, not as belief, which is an important difference from the Protestant forming of this. And this goes back to the ancient idea of what religion was. So we have a thing called the Missal. This is the Novus Ordo, okay? Means the new Mass, or the new order. We're in year B, or we're going to be in year B. This is 24. I have 25 somewhere. I should have grabbed it. Okay. Anyway, so this gives you what's called the liturgy. And there's little sayings and poems and hymns that form our beliefs. We say this every single Mass, every Mass. If I have the old Latin Missal, it's in a shoebox. I don't want to go find it right now. That would take too long. And that will show you how certain beliefs are coming from the old Latin, or from the Latin Mass. And so the Latin Mass is what teaches us, the liturgy of the Latin Mass is what teaches us certain belief systems. One of the most popular and most famous liturgies is called the John Christensen Mass. And that liturgy is one of the most oldest liturgies that there is in the Christian world. That's still practiced today. So we're getting our beliefs from the practice that we do, as well as from our creeds. We don't necessarily go to a catechism like a Protestant might. The catechisms there are more as a guide for the bishops, not for the practicing faithful. Another thing that we use is called tradition, holy tradition. And I'll get into that in a bit over here. But so these are the traditions of the lives of the saints. Now, this is not deep stuff. This is 1 or 2 pages of a brief history of a saint, and it gives a prayer. Now, Protestants understand this as prayer to the saint. Catholics understand it as prayers through the saint, but really it's a prayer straight to God, and it says basically to help you act, or to help you take help you be as faithful as a specific saint, or to do an action that a specific saint did, or to show dedication to God as a specific saint did. That's all that it is to help learn a lesson from that. This over here is called the Liturgy of the Hour. So we've been doing this actually on my channel. We've been doing the office readings. But basically, you have poems, you have hymns, you have dedicated days, you have prayers. Basically, think of it as a prayer book for a Protestant. And this has all the Psalms as well, and it's broken up into when you're supposed to read it. This used to be, for most people, it's also called a breviary. This is not a breviary. This is the long form. This is 4 volumes. But there's a breviary version, which is what's most popular and was mostly used in medieval times for this kind of thing. All right, let's continue.
Breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church in the
14, 15.
late 15th century. I follow in the footsteps of individuals like Luke.
He's following a tradition that stems from 1552 or 1556. I'm following a tradition that comes from somewhere between the birth of the church at Pentecost around 33 to the establishment of the formal church at Nicaea in, I guess, 451. I don't know exactly what Nicaea is right now. But my tradition is immensely older than his tradition. And what happens with the original church, the ante-Nicene church, that doesn't mean anti as in against, it means before Nicene church, is that all the major branches, all the patriarchs, there's 5 patriarchates, are making claim that they are that original church and that the other patriarchates broke away. But the honest truth, and everybody knows it in all these groups, we just pretend like we don't, is that all of us were originally one group, and only when we're all together are we actually the original church. So there you go.
Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and Melanchthon, in that they saw what was going on in the church and they reformed it back to what was original to the faith and sort of like scraping away some of the trappings, the moss that had grown
Yes.
on the church. And so
Which is completely untrue. What they ended up doing is they used a later version of Christianity and applied that to the Bible, which was a later addition to the Christianity that had been practiced for over 100 years. Before the Bible came into existence as the Bible, as in this, before this existed as one thing, these were all separate traditions. And before these separate oral traditions existed, there was this liturgy. And before there was liturgy, there was prayer and practice. So prayer, practice, and rite becomes written down and becomes formal liturgy. There are multiple formal liturgies, the oldest of which is still practiced, at least that's the claim, is the St. John Chrysostom Mass, which is a beautiful Mass. If you've never heard it, it's beautiful. It's called a divine liturgy. So sometime between the advent of Paul, because Paul is the first to write anything that we consider New Testament, sometime between Paul's conversion and the Council of Nicaea, the Bible is developed. It doesn't quite look like this right away. It takes a long time. And one of the books that is in contention is going to be the book of Revelation. Nobody wants it in there. Nobody thinks it's official. And there are other books that everybody desperately wants in there, such as the I was going to say the Epistle of Barnabas, not the Epistle one, such as the Shepherd of Hermas, such as the Letters of Clement, which they desperately want to be part of the Bible and they consider Scripture. What's interesting is that by the time this is done, Revelation, which is the least approved, is going to be in, and the Shepherd of Hermas and the Letters of Clement will be out. It is an interesting process that you can follow along with if you read early church documents.
As part of that, there are certain belief systems that I hold to, one of which during the Protestant Reformation was sola scriptura, Scripture alone. And so the idea of that was not that other things like tradition or experience don't have a...
And the problem with sola scriptura is that it denies these principles. So sola scriptura only leaves you with the literal or the plain and simple meaning, which is actually endorsed by John Chrysostom. But it ignores the spiritual, the allegorical, the tropological, and the analogical. Or the allegorical, the metaphor, the moral, ethic, and the anagogic. Now, there are other senses that Catholics will use as well. Usually they come from great figures like Augustine, and even in the Bible itself. So you have liturgical, mystical, or mystery. Liturgical, mystery, typology, and theora, mystical. Mystical is one that I really like, but most of the people you think of as heretics are the ones who go to the theora. But theora is very fun, and it's also much more popular in Eastern Orthodoxy than it is in Latin Catholicism.
A place within the conversation, but that sola scriptura was that Scripture is the sole infallible rule and faith for practice in the church. Okay. And so the idea is that ultimately you're looking for...
Again, part of the problem with sola scriptura is that it denies the very recontextualization that Jesus does in the Gospels, and that the authors of the Gospels, I'm not talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I'm talking about like the actual, whoever wrote it, whoever they were, the system that they used to recontextualize the Bible. They use typology. So if you deny typology, and Redeemed Zoomer has a great, if you go to his X, he has a great thread on this. If you deny typology, if you deny these other readings, you end up getting these false understandings of Christianity. This is a Calvinist saying this, okay? So I just want to be very clear. When you do a James White, you're going to be denying key aspects of Christian dogma. Because without these other ways of reading the Bible, you can't get the dogma that Protestants are defending.
The meaning that comes out of Scripture. And I totally admit that that gives me a bias in the sense that I adhere to thinking that that is true. Thinking that
There is dogma that he believes that he cannot get to through a plain and simple reading. So, there is a cognitive dissonance in the mind of Wes Huff that cannot be answered. And that is sad because he doesn't have to become Catholic to understand this. Anglicans accept this. Eastern Orthodox accept this. Coptics accept this. Russian Orthodox accept this. There are many other ways than just becoming Catholic to understand this. But as an evangelical Protestant, he can never bridge that divide.
Claims, and particularly the worldview claims, that something like historic Christianity in the Bible, that those are truth statements that can be verifiable, but that are true ultimately, and that does create a bias.
Yeah.
But I think, you can hold my field in biblical studies, there are a lot of secular scholars, and they also come in with a bias. And so it's not that it's like religious scholars versus secular scholars. We agree on a whole host of things, but often it's not the evidence and the rationale that we're disagreeing on, it's the conclusions that we then draw from it.
Right. Yes. Okay. So within the Bible, it's obviously it's an unbelievable book towards any part of human history because it has so many stories that are related.
I don't like that term unbelievable. I'd say it's a believable book, but then again, I am a Catholic.
To life, so many teachings, and there is
The joke and the pun aside, the first time I read the Bible, I found it completely unbelievable. And I was able to ride with most of it. By the way, this is a time, I want to be very clear. When I found the Bible unbelievable was also a time I thought I could have been a vampire. Okay? I was like 13 or 15 years old. I loved vampires. I loved werewolves. I loved magic. I thought magic was real. So an illogical teenager's mind rejected the Bible for being illogical and too fanciful. Okay? And the reason for the rejection was the giants and the people living for over 100 years. Actually, the 150 stuff didn't bother me. It's when we got to the thousands, I was just like, what is this? What are we doing? And the begots just broke me, man. Getting through the begots was so hard. So, yeah, I couldn't, I didn't deny Jesus. I didn't deny God, but I couldn't accept the Bible, not for what it was. So I had to read a lot of other literature to compartmentalize. I don't know. I can't say the word right now, but to be able to put it in context of the other writings. And once I saw how other ancient cultures wrote their religions and wrote their histories, reading the Bible made so much more sense and was so much more easier to comprehend.
that there are things that are literally confirmed historical fact within there throughout the Bible for sure. But there's also a lot of stuff that it's
So I've done a stream before where I've talked about where the history begins, and there were like 3 or 4 different points, whether it's the Battle of Kadesh, whether it's I think the third king after the king of David, whether it's there's another battle. There's several points in the Bible where history begins, where you can actually point to real things. And then sometime after the Davidic stories, you start getting into history that is very easy to get one-for-one correlations on. But if you're talking about Genesis, that just doesn't happen. You have a lot in Genesis that is unverifiable. That doesn't mean false. It just means completely unverifiable.
like we were talking about one off camera. Like, all right, did Jonah really get?
And when things are unverifiable, you have to go with probability, especially if you're a secular scholar who's trying to go with what's most likely to have happened. So you go with the most probable understanding, not necessarily the correct understanding. It's a different game that's being played.
Swallowed by a whale and living there for.
And Wes is trying to mix those two games, and I think that is a mistake. And I think Dr. Kipp and other Dan McKellen and Joshua Bowen and Bart Ehrman will all say it's a mistake to mix your faith with your academic studies. You can, but you have to make clear delineations. And Wes is doing this thing. He's twisting it all into itself. And I think that's going to cause him problems down the line with his credibility, not with the Protestant scholars, but with Catholics and with secular scholars. I think that's going to hurt his credibility way down the line.
For 3 days, there's things that I've always looked at as like that's a lesson rather than a history. Furthermore, and I always bring this up when I'm talking with guys about anything ancient text. I think you have to. We're human beings, so we're fallible. We make mistakes. There's some sort of, there's a name for it, but like the basic experiment where they have like 20 people sit in a circle and they each whisper a story into each other's ear.
Yeah, the telephone
I was going to say the telephone game.
game.
Right. Yes. That's the way to put it. So by the end, it changes by whatever small percentage it is. Maybe it's like 5 or 7% or something. So like you think about that in one setting, in 1 minute, in one day. And then you think about the fact that like the Bible is composed of all these stories that in many ways were passed down for.
Well, they're compilations of different traditions, some of which coalesced very well, some of which did not. What's interesting is that there's a theory, and I really do agree with this theory, that the Bible preserves the contradictory theories because it doesn't want to make a judgment on which one is correct. It doesn't. The editors and the redactors don't want to prefer one theory over another theory, so they put both theories together, and you just figure it out. Okay, this happened and that happened. They can't both have happened at the same time. You decide for yourself which one is the way that it really happened. Is it 2 different perspectives? Is it 3 different perspectives? Is it 4 different perspectives? And what's interesting is that while this exists in the Old Testament, it exists within the Gospels, where you have these 4 stories that if you try to line them up side by side, they don't exactly fit, even though if you read them separately, all the events are in there. So you have to reconcile all of this, especially if you're going to keep your faith.
And many times like thousands of years, if not hundreds of years. And it's like, well, human bias can change it. Story changing can change it. Do you ever struggle with, what's real and what's not just on the base of like human fallibility with anything you read? And that doesn't just include the Bible. That also includes other things you read from anything in what we would call ancient history.
Yeah.
I don't like the way that he worded that. I thought that was too broad. He had a perfect question for Wes that was right on, which was in the Bible. Do you have a problem reconciling the historical record with what you understand about the Bible? That's a really good question. That's what he asked right there about, hey, look, you understand that oral tradition is flawed. This comes from an oral tradition. There are competing traditions recorded in the Bible. Does that cause you a problem? And instead, he goes, with anything that you read. And I think that's a cop-out. I would like Wes to ask the question specifically spot on with the Bible.
Definitely. I mean, in the UK, they call the telephone game Chinese Whispers, and as a good PC Canadian, somehow that doesn't seem appropriate. But yeah, I mean, so just as to back up, I'm a trained historian, so that's what my education is in. And so I think as a trained historian, I
am an untrained historian and an untrained reader. I am raw and uncontrolled. I am wild, man.
I'm perfectly comfortable with saying that historiography draws conclusions to the inference of the best explanation. And ideally what you're looking for is cross-reference sources, ideally independent sources that can have different angles or perspectives on a particular story. And that's not always possible. Now, with the New Testament, we have a lot of that. But when you're talking about something like the Old Testament, I would grant that there are different levels of probability to certain stories. Now, I don't think that means that they're not true, but I think as a
But see, philosophical truth is different than historical probability. So something being historical accurate, let's put it this way, you can have the facts and you can have the truth, and they don't always coincide. So let's say you have 3 facts. There's like 20 facts to a situation. You only have 3 of them. So you're going to come to a certain conclusion based on where these 3 points are pointing. Someone else has another set of facts, and they're going to go to a different direction. And then you say, well, this fact can't be both true at the same time. So you're picking which fact you think is more probable. And based on that, you're going to gauge what you believe. So we're talking about Jonah and the well, and you are taking a plain and simple reading of the Bible. Well, now we got a problem. So whose facts are true? Is it a true story of a prophet that refused to follow his his calling from God, and therefore had a horrible experience, and we're expressing it through analogy and metaphor? Or is it the story of a guy who defied God's will and ended in the belly of a whale? Like that's a very complicated question to ask. And if you're only going to be literal, you have a lot more explaining to do than where you can say, well, no, that's a metaphor for all this other stuff that happened. You know, the belly of the prophet might be real and this stuff might be real, but the story itself doesn't need to be literal for you to get the point of what the story is. So stuff like that. Job is a drawing from an older tradition, and thus that older tradition, I said older, not oral, does that older tradition have different lineages, different ideas? So does it make Job one of the oldest stories in the Bible? Or is Job one of the newer stories that draws from traditions that are older than it, but not older than the Bible itself? These are different questions, and depending on which facts you pick, you're going to have a slightly different opinion.
If I put my historian hat on, I would say that something like Jonah being swallowed by the fish has a less probabilistic conclusion in terms of its truth than something.
Talking donkey. Where are we on talking donkey? Because talking crow, I can go with. I've seen dogs and cats say, simple words like hello, hi, mom, dad, yes, no. I've seen cats and dogs do that. So, ow, why am I still doing that with my eye?
Thing like, and I would put the resurrection in a high category, simply because you have multiple independent lines of witness testimony that are indicating that Jesus lived, he was alive, he died, and then people saw him not dead. And so you have multiple lines of streams of evidence, and individuals from different places at different times who are.
See, when he calls, I don't think you should call it evidence. You should call it different assertions. You have different traditions. You could say that, but to call the tradition, to call the oral history a line of evidence is different. It's a data point, and it's one that we can choose to trust and believe in and call true. Every time I flex my eyebrows, it just hurts. Sorry for the flinching.
Corroborating that fact. Now, you don't have that with something like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's not true. It just means, as a historian, I put things on a different level of probability. So, I would grant, and I would even say that some of the miracles of Jesus, when Jesus turns water into wine at Cana, at the beginning of John's Gospel, that has a lower probability of truth in the grand scheme.
So one of the problems here with a lot of these, let's call them Protestant apologists, is that they take the different witnesses within the narrative. They take the different characters within the narrative as different witnesses. That is false. That is not true. Your witness is the one single gospel. So John, as in the gospel, not the person, John is one witness. This is an oral testimony. What am I saying? Matthew is a witness. Mark is a witness. The epistles, each epistle is a different witness. Not all the epistles together with Peter, because not all of Peter. So there's Peter and pseudo Peter. Not all of Paul, because there's Paul and there's pseudo Paul. So what you have is you have these different witnesses that are the papers, the manuscripts, and then there's different versions, different accountings of each witness's testimony. It is not every character in the Bible that is a witness, because we don't know if the author made them up or not. So the witness is the actual gospel individually, and that's the witness account, not each character who says they saw something within the gospel. You get what I'm saying? You guys following?
Of things from a historical perspective than the resurrection, because it's only being referred to as coming from one source.
So and I remember this morning when we were going to Dunkin' Donuts, we were talking about this a little bit, but obviously people watching right now weren't with us at Dunkin' Donuts, but we were going through how I believe in the
And this is why I'm thinking he might be playing dumb, because he might have had a more intelligent conversation beforehand, set up how he's going to ask the questions, and now he's asking them in a way that's easy for his audience to comprehend, or who he views his audience as being the kind of questions that he thinks his audience likes to hear.
Ron, they say Jesus wasn't crucified, right?
Yeah.
They say someone else like stood in for him, maybe it was Judas or something like that. But the evidence does point to the fact that, because like we know Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure, that's all confirmed and everything. We know he did a lot of things and was a huge public figure, but like the evidence.
So saying it that way is very false. So I believe Jesus is real, and I believe the probability of Jesus being real is very high. So definitely Jesus is a real individual. Connecting the Jesus of history to the Jesus that comes out of the compilation of the Gospels and the epistles, or even just the Gospels alone, is a much bigger statement. So to say that we know exactly what Jesus did is slightly difficult to say. To say that Jesus most likely existed is the right way to say it. So yes, Jesus is most likely real historically. And I, as a Catholic or as a Christian, believe he's real through faith. I do not question that he is real. But if this man is not a Christian and he doesn't speak like a Christian, then he should not be testifying to Christ unless he believes. Because once he testifies to Christ, then he's liable for his belief. Do you get what I'm saying? And what could then happen is he could then twist the message of Christianity to something that is non-Christian like, which is something that Billy Carson does.
Does point to the fact that he was actually crucified because of all the witnesses that were there up to and including like the Roman guards themselves not being able to mistake a guy.
Again, the Roman guards being there do not count as witnesses. They're not separate witnesses. The account of them is one witness. The accounting of John is a witness, not the characters within John's narrative. So the 500 witnesses, we don't have their voices. We don't have 500 separate accounts of Jesus reappearing. We have one account that claims 500 witnesses. Do you see? So we can't anachronistically or time travel wise go back in time and then say, okay, we have 500 witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. No, we have one witness in John. We have another witness in Matthew. We have another witness in Mark. We have another witness in Luke. If Luke and Acts are the same author, then we have another witness in Luke and Acts. If they're separate authors, we have two more witnesses. We have Paul witnessing not the events, but witnessing the after effects. You have Tactius witnessing the after effects. Christians exist. So we know it's very likely Jesus existed because Christians exist, so most likely their leader existed. Did Romans crucify people? Yes. So a crucified Messiah figure, not out of the question. This happened. Do you see what I'm saying? So the way that he's wording it is very sloppy and not careful at all.
Guy who was so known like this. So therefore, if you also have, I'm extrapolating this, but if you also have evidence on the other end of that of people who, after witnessing him be killed on the cross, witnessed him alive, come out of the tomb, that's why you're saying something like the resurrection has like good empirical data, even though the actual event itself, technically defies the laws of physics and humanity and pretty much every fucking thing.
Let's see, there's the F slur. Which again, I'm not against F slur. The F word section, one of my favorite words in the English vocabulary. Give me 1 second. The pain's starting to get to me just a little bit. Let me take a quick pill and let me get some water, and I'll be right back. I'm going to take a quick break, y'all. It's not going to be longer than 2 minutes. Okay, I got some more ointment on my eye. Took some Tylenol. We should be good.
Thing we do.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we call it a
And
miracle
for those who are watching, let me know if what I'm saying is making sense. If you're understanding what I'm trying to express to you all, and if you're getting it, please.
for a reason, right?
Right.
People don't usually rise from the dead. If they did, then it wouldn't be a miracle. But yeah, in the sense of it's a historical question in saying someone's alive, someone's empirically dead, but then they're being seen alive again. So
Right.
what is the inference to the best explanation for that? And there are a number of conclusions based on secular materialism of, say, the mass hallucination theory or the mistaken theory. You know, there are individuals in the past, historians, who have tried to come up with
So again, what he's doing here is apologetics. This is not history. I believe Jesus rose from the dead, and I believe all his disciples saw him, and I believe the Thomas story. But Thomas is not a witness. The witness is the text saying that Thomas did this. Because we don't have Thomas's words, we have the gospel that claims that Thomas did this thing. Do you see?
alternative explanations.
So I trust the gospels, but but someone saying that the gospels are have multiple witnesses is slightly misleading you, because there are the witnesses within one witness.
Just find them, and not just me, I mean, the vast
Testament,
majority of
tradition.
New Testament scholarship has said, believing or not, that they're really not very strong in the grand scheme of things. And that,
So let's say we're playing baseball, and I hit a baseball, and I say it's a home run, and I say to you, and Billy and Bob and Joe and everyone was there. You could ask everybody who was there, and Johnny has told all of his friends about me hitting that home run. That's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different witnesses. That's still my eyewitness testimony. Do you see?
and that's why, so when I was investigating Islam, one of the main problems that I had was
And
this
that's why
historical-
it's problematic when people think of the Bible as a single book, because then it becomes only one testimony, one source. And it's not a single book. It's multiple books, so there's multiple attestations. Blah.
problem, where in chapter 4, verse
Attestation.
157 of the Quran, it says that Jesus was not, neither was he killed, nor was
Univocal cavity. Still can't do it.
he crucified, but it was made to appear to them. And then it says actually that those who believe it are not totally sure about this fact, which is
Why does it say that?
your guess is as good as mine. In fact, the problem with that
Let's go back and hear what you just said. Sweetheart, it's okay.
Islam, one of the main problems that I had was this historical problem, where in chapter 4, verse 157 of the Quran, it says that Jesus was not, neither was he killed, nor was he crucified, but it was made to appear to them. And then it says actually that those who believe it are not totally sure about this fact, which is
Why does it say that?
Because it's dealing with the questions, the questions with the Christians of the time. And at one point in the Quran, it wants the Christians as allies for warfare. So it says they are to be trusted. And then at a later time period, the Christians had betrayed them and they were now their enemies. So now the Christians had to be conquered. Now, the Christians had a slightly higher status than Jewish people in the Quran. Don't ask me why. For a Jewish person, originally the Jews were their allies, and then the Jewish people become their enemies after a specific battle where they felt they were betrayed. And it's not all the Muslims; it's the people within Muhammad's group in this caravan, which becomes a group of warlords. I'm not saying anything shocking or bad. This is how the Quran itself describes itself. And again, these are all different oral traditions that then get written down into one tradition, which there's like 5 or 6 or so different versions of. And there's different types of Islam that ascribe to different oral traditions. The one that we all know here in America, because of what happened in our past with Islam, that version only has one Quran that they use, and that's the one that they try to say is a standard for all Islamists, but not all people who are Muslims ascribe to the same tradition.
your guess is as good as mine. In fact, the problem with that particular surah, that particular chapter of the Quran, is that in the Islamic sources, you have a lot of commentary. So you have other Islamic literature. You have the Quran, which is the holy book. Then you have the Hadith and the Tafsir. And included in that group of literature are authoritative commentaries.
Tafsir is just Bible. It's just Quran commentary. The Hadith is the stuff that contextualizes it, and the Hadith have different style of records. Think of the Hadith as different church fathers, and think of the Tafsir as a study Bible or study Bible commentary.
But there is no authoritative commentary on this particular passage, and so there's a lot of different theories dependent on how you interpret that it was made to appear to them. So this is part of what we're talking about at Dunkin' Donuts. And for me, I mean, even if you go to the most skeptical iteration of historical biblical scholarship, if they can say basically, we can know very little, if anything, about Jesus, they'll say, we do know that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And we know that because not only do we have these 4 biographies that we call the Gospels, we have Paul and then Jude and James all testifying to it. And then you have other sources like the Jewish Romano historian Josephus.
How do you spell that?
Josepa.
Again, I feel like this is like a false. I don't know. I just feel like Josephus is very well known. This seems like a false question.
H-U-S, I believe. So Josephus was he was one of the key historiographers, particularly.
The problem is that parts of the stuff with Josephus that seems to coincide, is that the right word? Confirm Jesus is stuff that has been altered by later people. Now, the alterations are not as terrible as some mythicists like to make it sound. So there's that line definitely was talking about Christ, but what it says about Christ might not have been what it was saying in the original text.
Commenting on Flavius Josephus. So he lived in the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. And he specifically recounts not just mentioning Jesus' name, but also Jesus' brother James, and talks about the fact that James was stoned to death in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of historical credibility, not just on the historical Jesus, but that he was crucified, particularly crucified under.
And again, the statement that he just said, well, I agree with, is misleading. So there's a lot of strong assertion to Jesus existing when compared to other people who existed that we don't have evidence for. By not saying the full sentence and by doing this shorthand, it makes it sound as if it's more probable than what it actually is. So there's more evidence for Jesus than compared to people who we have no evidence for, who we also know existed. Do you get what I'm saying? So he's playing a little bit of a semantic game here, which is the apologetics interfering with his historian scholarly status.
Pontius Pilate, other individuals, Tacitus, who's a key figure in how we get information about the Roman emperors. Tacitus, there were a few individuals. There was Tacitus, there's Plutarch, there was Cassius Dio, there was, these individuals who were Roman historiographers within this period of Greco-Roman antiquity, who were writing on people like the emperors. A lot of them mention.
What years are we talking about with them writing, approximately?
So end of 1st century, beginning of 2nd century.
Okay, so like 100, 200 years after Jesus?
No, so within a 100-year period. So the 1st century is when Jesus lived. So Jesus
he lived till 33 AD, right?
Yeah, 33 AD, and then you have these individuals.
Just to be clear, we don't know exactly when Jesus was born. He wasn't actually born on 0. He could have been born 3 years earlier. He could have been born 5 years later. And depending on how you break that up, that will tell you which, I would say praetor, which governor was in charge of Judea and which emperor was in charge of the empire. And also, that affects the death. So he could be born up to 3 years before, up to 3 years later. So he could be anywhere from 30 to 36. I don't know anybody who goes beyond 37. You'd have to talk to the biblical critical scholars for that. But me personally, I haven't read anything that goes beyond 37. But anywhere from 30 to 36 seems to be when Jesus died.
Was commenting, but that's pretty common. I mean, when we're talking on ancient writing, we do have to be careful because we come from a hyper-literate culture. So almost everybody is literate, And we write a lot of stuff down.
Yes.
In the ancient world, at the
Not like
height
that.
of the Roman Empire, only about 10% of Rome proper was literate. And in somewhere like Roman-occupied Judea and Galilee, where Jesus was coming from, it probably never topped about 3%.
Yeah.
And
Sounds
these
right.
these were hyper-oral cultures.
Yeah, sounds right.
actually,
Even though I knew no other facts, but somehow I agree with this one.
there's a lot of talk, no pun intended, in the writing of some of these famous orators in the ancient world, Greek and Roman, talking about how important it is that you memorize things. In fact, Socrates decried writing and reading because he said it would.
So Jimmy Akin has tried making this argument many, many times, but I've also heard the other argument the other way. So this is not a great argument, and I wish they would stop making it. Just say it's an oral tradition and that it's subject to the faults and fallacies of any other oral tradition, because we believe in inspiration. We believe that those parameters were fenced in by the Holy Spirit guiding the correct tradition to be preserved.
Would make people lazy and they wouldn't remember things.
Socrates said this?
Socrates said this. Yeah, ironically, we only know that because Plato wrote it down in part of his dialogues. But Socrates says that people would get lazy if they read too much because they wouldn't.
So here's a question about that as someone who loves Socrates. Is that actually one of Socrates' actual quotes? Is that something that Plato made up? And is it from the earlier tradition, which is actually, most scholars agree, is actually about Socrates and about what Socrates really said? Or is it from the later tradition that developed later in the life of Plato, where Plato was now using Socrates as a character?
Be dependent on how good their memories could remember things. Yeah, so there was a completely different perspective in the ancient world, and memorization was a whole part of this. You had this.
God, I'm the opposite of that. That's crazy. I just looked at, yeah, you're right. I was looking that up. Yeah.
But we live in a completely different culture, right?
Yeah.
We have these supercomputers in our pockets, and so we know a lot about a little, but we don't know. Did I say that right?
Yeah,
We
a
know,
little about a lot.
we know a little about a lot.
But
We
not
don't
a
know a
lot
lot
about
about a
a
little.
little.
Yeah. So because we can just look things up on Wikipedia, right?
Yeah.
Like you just pulled up. But in the ancient world, that wasn't possible. And part of being and showing your education was that you
It
could
scares
not.
me that people have to say that. I lived in a time when that wasn't possible.
Only memorize things, but that you could paraphrase it very accurately. So someone like Josephus is writing, and he is writing. So he writes a document called the Antiquities of the Jews, where he literally.
I want to keep going for another hour, guys, but my eyes really bothering me. I might only go about 15 more minutes, just FYI, okay? And maybe even less than that.
Goes back and he tries to write this treatise of proving to the Romans, you shouldn't annihilate us because our origin goes back into ancient times as well.
Were
Because
the Romans thinking about annihilating them
so
at the time he was writing that?
yeah, so in 70 AD, so the problem with the Jews in Roman occupied Judea is that they were constantly rebelling because they saw themselves as God's people, right? Israel was the promised land. Now they're being occupied by an imperial system, and particularly by an emperor who's calling himself.
Now, part of the retelling that Wes gives here is a little bit inaccurate. So there were exceptions for any religion that was considered ancient. So the Jews were allowed to have a singular God, and the Jews were allowed to worship their own God and not to worship the other gods. And the Christians were kind of grandfathered in under this clause until the Christian-Jewish split became more evident, or sometimes called the church-synagogue split. So this is slightly an improper retelling of that split, and is concentrating too much on the Jewish aspect and not enough on the Roman aspect, if you will. So the problem that the Romans had with Jewish people was the rebellion. The problem wasn't their belief system or anything like that. So Wes is kind of conflating a little bit here. It could be just because of time, could be because he just hasn't read it in a long time. I lived with Roman literature and Roman history for a very long time, so I have a very strong grasp of it. I don't have the strongest, and I've never read it in Latin.
God.
And at the time, who was the emperor that we're talking about? 70?
We're
look it up.
Tiberius.
Okay.
Well, not so Tiberius was during Jesus, but I think
Right after Tiberius. I'll take a look.
yeah. And so, who is it? Does it say?
I just see spouses right now. What? Oh, successor, Caligula.
Yes. So,
Okay.
so they're quashing all of these rebellions. I mean, this is where you get the group called the Zealots. So there were different groups, factions of Judaism. So if you ever read the Gospels, you're going to come up with groups like the Sadducees and the Pharisees.
So I don't like the way that he said that this is where the zealots come from, because the zealots were around before Jesus. So again, he the way he's telling the story isn't exactly correct. You have to look into the Maccabees, but he's not someone who believes in the inspiration of the Maccabees, so he's going to downplay that. So he's not going to mention it, and I think that's a mistake, because what he's talking about is specifically about the Maccabees. So he's going to mention, I think he does mention the hammer, Judas Maccabeus, but because he's not, because he doesn't believe in the inspiration of the book of Maccabees, he's going to downplay it, and that means that the way that he's describing who the zealots were is a little bit off.
Yes.
And the zealots. The zealots were basically, I mean, there's a reason why we have that word in English. We've kind of imported it. Is they were a group of very hyper-religious Jews who just basically believed that they were going to force the Romans out. And so, in fact, one of Jesus' disciples is Simon the Zealot. And there's varying degrees as to like how intense his zealotry was. Part of the complicatedness of who he was that one of the other disciples was a tax collector. Levi, or Matthew, was a tax collector. And the tax collectors were literally the opposites in terms of the political spectrum from the zealots. So the tax collectors are talked about very unfavorably in the Gospels and in a lot of Jewish literature from this time, because they were the sellouts. Not only were they seen as working for Rome, but they were actually collecting the money from the people that was funding the occupation. And so,
don't tread on me.
Yeah, so there were lots of there was lots of political turmoil in the first century, which is why when the Pharisees asked the question to Jesus of should you pay taxes to Caesar, it's not actually about taxes; it's about moral compromise. But anyways, so going back to your question about the uprisings. There were a number of uprisings immediately after Jesus' death, and the one that really hit its peak culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem. So the Romans go in 70 AD, and they say, we've had enough of this. They sack Jerusalem, and they destroy the temple. So the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. And
but again, without understanding the history of the Maccabees, you're missing something here. So Alexander the Great comes in, conquers all of what we would call Mesopotamia and Egypt. Then he dies, and he gives it to his generals. Two of his generals fight over who's in charge of Israel. Tired of this subjugation, Judas Maccabeus, or someone in this period, ends up, I guess maybe the Herodians possibly, end up asking Rome for help. And Rome comes in. This is going to be Julius Caesar and Pompey, and Pompey goes off. If you ever wonder why Pompey just disappears for a little while, it's because he's off conquering Jerusalem. And so when that happens, the Romans then demand protection money to keep the Greeks out. The Greeks will then disappear and they'll become the Persians. But the point is, they're going to keep the enemy out, and they're going to protect Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a protectorate. And this is how Rome gets its power. Eventually, the Romans start doing things that the Greeks were doing. So the Greeks aren't really the Greeks. The Greeks are actually the Macedonians, and that's kind of beside the point. But because the Hellenes were worshiping false gods in the temple, once the Romans start sacrificing to false gods in the temple and disrespecting the Jewish laws, that is why the Jewish people rebel. So it's not a Christian thing; it's a Jewish thing. I hope I'm getting the story correct.
never built back. So that's the Temple Mount that the Dome of the Rock is on right now in Jerusalem.
Okay, so this is under. Wow, there were. I'm just looking through the Roman emperors. There were a ton, like in a very short time span. A lot of these guys were getting whacked, I guess. So this is under.
So in 70
Vespasian?
yes, under Vespasian.
Wow, there were like 10
Yeah.
between him and Tiberius.
Yeah.
Shit.
There was a lot of turnover for various reasons in the Roman imperial system. So, and this becomes actually a very concrete number, is usually when we talk about dating Christian documents, particularly the New Testament, it's either a question of is it pre-70 or is it post-70? Because the destruction of the temple becomes such a big event. And Jesus predicts it in the Gospels. So part of the, so Jesus in the Gospels says that the temple will be destroyed, and that no stone will be left on top of another. And then he uses that as an analogy to say, destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. So he uses it as this, like, because his disciples are saying, Jesus, look at the temple, look how great it is. And he says, yeah, but the temple is finite. And they're like, Jesus, what do you mean the temple is finite? And he uses that as an example of saying, no, I am the true temple. Because the temple is the presence of God on earth. And so he's saying that, no, it's not about this building. I'm going to be that. And actually, the beginning of John's gospel says that. It says in John 1:14 that the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And the word that's used there in Greek is literally he tabernacled among us. And the tabernacle was before the temple was built. It was the place where God's presence dwelt in the Holy of Holies. So Jesus plays on this and predicts the destruction of the temple. And so some scholars say, well, Jesus couldn't have done that pre-70 AD. So these gospels have to be written after, and it's been imposed back on the mouth of Jesus.
I mean, there are some words that I would choose differently there, but this is a fair accounting of the difference between the apologetic dating and the secular dating. It's fair enough.
Is part of the argumentation for dating them later. But there was a lot of rebellion going on.
Yeah, it's a wild time. Also because that area, the Holy Land, is just throughout.
But again, it's not impossible for someone at that time period to not know where it's going. Because if you view history as secular, and you look at what happened with the Egyptians, assuming, and of course you're assuming that the Jewish people at the time would have viewed the Egyptian exile and Exodus as real. And you look at as literal history, and then you look at what happened with the Assyrians and with the Babylonians, and even to some extent with the Hittites. The Jewish people at the time would have been primed to think of the temple being sacked. So this is not an out of the realm prediction for someone to make. So just to be clear, there could have been other messiahs that also made the same prediction about the temple, and Jesus is one of these who made this prediction and was crucified for it. So that is possible. So don't think that just because, we have to date it later. No, it's possible he made the prediction because other people could have made the prediction as well. So it doesn't have to be supernatural. We're choosing to call it supernatural because we believe that God in the incarnation, in his word, in his incarnated word, is making prophecy.
Human history, I mean, there's a reason it's called the Holy Land. There's a reason everyone fights over it. There's been wars there and everything. So even when you have something as large as like the Greater Roman Empire that at this point is controlling like all of Europe into Africa and into Asia, like this is just one area of it, and there's a lot of different cultures there that are fighting over things that are, no pun intended, like biblical to them. So it makes a lot of sense that there's uprising, but it's also, the fact that you have someone like a Jesus of Nazareth living kind of smack dab in the middle of that time period is also, I don't know, patternistically interesting as well, because he dies. It's not like Christianity as a broad religion with many following is born the next day. It is born, but it's not like, you had like millions of people like, fuck yeah, we love Jesus. That took a long time. So you keep on bringing up the gospel.
I really wish Wes would have said, hey, if you're going to do this, you can't cuss. I really do.
I think this is a really good place to kind of go to the history with that. But we have the 4 main gospels in the Bible.
Yep.
There are other gospels that are written. We can kind of get to that.
Totally.
But can you just walk me through the timeline of when they were written and who wrote them and how they came upon the stories within there?
Yeah, so this is a really debated topic within New Testament studies. I would take a very early dating of the vast majority of the New Testament.
Which means he's taking the least probable. Not the least possible. The least probable dating.
With some caveats. Okay. So I would date Matthew, Mark, Luke, what are sometimes referred to as the synoptic gospels. So meaning that you can put them side by side and you have similar stories.
This is basically what he said and did on the Ali Beth Stuckey show. I think it was Ali Beth.
Right. Synos meaning to put side by side, and then optic meaning to see. So seeing them side by side. And there's an agreement upon the fact that there's some literary dependence from those three gospels, that the three authors of those gospels are.
Okay. We're going to stop here, guys, because my eye's bothering me, and I don't want to keep flinching throughout the rest of this video. Hopefully my eye is savable. Hopefully tomorrow they will have done whatever it is they got to do to clean out my eye, and I will have gone to work, and I will be here after work. So yeah. So hopefully that all goes down properly. Remember what I always say: love everyone, forgive everyone. God loves you, God forgives you, so forgive everyone and love everyone. Have a very good night. I might not do the secret sermon tonight just because my eyes are killing me, and I don't know if I can read the fine print today without getting a major headache. So if I'm not on later tonight, it's not because I don't want to do the secret sermon. It's because I have a slashed. Lisa didn't slash my cornea. At least I don't think she did. But I have a slashed eye. So as you can see, only one of them is kind of really working right now. In fact, earlier there was like a little wavy thing happening with the screen that kind of made me a little seasick. So I'm getting off. I love you all. Have a great time. Thomas, thank you for coming by. BS, thank you for coming by. Anyone else who's watching in incognito mode, thank you. Anyone who's watching later, please leave a comment. Comments really help. Anyone who wants my channel to do well, please, please, please share and like and subscribe. Anyway, talk to you all later. Have a good night. I don't know if we set up music this time. No, we didn't. So no music tonight. Sorry, Thomas. Everyone have a great night, and I will see you all either later tonight before I go to bed, or I will see you tomorrow.